Thank you so much for joining us today. Guam Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero, and I'm the co-chair of the Independence for Guam Task Force, and also the chairperson of the Educational Development and Research Committee for Independent Guam. I'll be joined in my presentation today by Dr. Michael Guzman Babaco, who's also the co-chair for the task force and the media chairperson for Independent Guam. Independent Guam is the larger group that is helping to educate about the political status option of independence. And we also have other members from our committee, or from our group here today. Keisha Borja-Kitsutsu, who also teaches here at the university, is the chairperson for our Organizational Development Committee. And Monique Flores is she works with the Guam Humanities Council, and she's also our chairperson for outreach. So all of us are here today. If you have any questions, we've provided a bunch of resources from our independence work. But we wanted to do a specific teaching today on war reparations, particularly because we believe this is an issue that has dragged on as long as it has, largely because of Guam's unincorporated territory status. And really it kind of points to the heart of what it's like to actually try to negotiate with Congress, and how a lot of times in Guam's issues that are very important to the people of Guam take a very long time to resolve in Congress. And so that's why this is titled World War II Reparations, 75 Years After Invasion. So today what we'll talk a little bit about is the history of Guam's quest for war reparations, how many efforts were made to finally achieve this, and then also we're going to take a look at the law itself, who qualifies for war reparations, how war reparations are going to be paid, and why this is something that connects to the larger issue of decolonization and interference. Okay, and then at the end, we're actually going to ask you to help us take action. So we ask that you stay to the end and hear through. Thank you. Okay, so I really wanted to dedicate this evening's presentation to Magdalena Santos Nicholas Bayani, who passed away just on December 30th at the age of 101. And so Tan Magdalena actually was a really incredible woman that I had the honor and privilege of sitting with and actually hearing her war story. And so a little bit of my background and why I'm very passionate about this and wanted to do this presentation today is that I've actually interviewed war survivors since I was 18 years old. So I've interviewed dozens of war survivors, and most of the people that I've spoken with have actually passed away since they've shared their story with me. And so at Tan Magdalena, I was working on a project with the Guam War Survivors Memorial Foundation in which we were documenting war stories. And so the story that she shared with me was published in the Marianas Variety and then in the Guam War Survivors Memorial Foundation's book. She also testified before the Guam War Claims Review Commission, which I'll talk a little bit about when we go through the history. But her story is that, you know, as a teenager, she was basically forced to work, right? She says, work, that's all we do every day, digging, collecting rocks and trashes, and oh, the sun was so hot. From morning to night, we didn't eat, but we are not hungry. If you are afraid, you don't feel hungry. And so Tan Magdalena shared how she and her family members were forced to basically clear what's now the runway in season. And while she was doing that, she and a bunch of other survivors, and it's really interesting because in different interviews with people who were from different villages, they all witnessed the same beheading at the same work camp. But she was so close to the beheading that the blood had splattered on her, and she could not move, she could not react. Because if you react, then you would be punished, right? And so that's what she meant about fear was greater than hunger. Even if they were hungry, their fear got them through the work they had to do. Another line that I was reminded of talking with her niece Monica today was that she had talked about how before the war she was supposed to get married. She says, after the war, my boyfriend came to look for me, and I told him that I was sorry, I forgot how to love you. Who's going to think to love when you're suffering? So I thought that was a really beautiful way to show us that war doesn't just affect us in these very physical ways, right? There was a lot of physical suffering, but there was also a lot of ways in which people came out of that war completely different than who they were before the war. So much so that somebody like Tan Magdalena could lose love for the person that they were in love with, that love can change. Your understanding of what love is can change. And so I was really saddened by her loss, and I think that she's an incredible woman. Like I said, she lived to be 101, and so I feel just honored to have caught the slightest glimpse of her life, and so I wanted to dedicate this presentation to her. Because she also said that there are people that always promise her war reparations, but she doesn't think that she'll actually live to the day to see it. And she was right? So she lived to the day of the announcement that war reparations may be paid in the near future, but she didn't actually ever receive compensation for what she experienced. So what did she and others on Guam experience? Well, I wanted to kind of show you a glimpse of what Hagåtña was like before the war and what the island was like immediately after the war. So not only were the people forced into labor, not only were there people who were massacred or beheaded, not only were there rapes and sexual abuse, not only were there times where people in families had to figure out new ways of obtaining food or new places to live. Mostly what happened in the war was that people really came together and sort of returned to the land and relied on each other. There became this whole system of survival that kept our ancestors living through that war. And so oftentimes we think about the war in the context of liberation and this notion that we were saved from the war by the United States. But if you actually spend time with war survivors, their daily experience wasn't this like bloody, traumatic suffering. It was more about survival. Their daily experience was, how do we get from one day to the next? From the youngest child to the oldest person, it was about survival. And they knew how to survive the war because, as you can see, we were a very healthy community prior to the war. And because of our connection to the land, because of our ability to care for the land, care for each other, feed ourselves, most people survived the war. But they came out of the war hungry and very afraid of what they had been through, right? Those are the two things most war survivors say that they felt or experienced, right? And so immediately after the war, one of the hardest things that happened is that when the United States returned, they bombed the entire island. And so a lot of people did not have homes to return to. They also took a lot of land to basically finish the war effort, right? So Guam was used to win the war against Japan. And so 75% of the island had been occupied by the U.S. Military immediately after the war. And so where did the people who lived in those places go, right? A lot of them had to rebuild their lives elsewhere, and a lot of them never got their lands back, right? And so in 1944 and 1945, people weren't necessarily thinking about filing war claims, right? However, the United States government did offer war claims to Guam in 1945, and there was a short window of time, about a year, in which people were called on to file claims. There weren't many claims filed, and in fact, most of the claims that were filed were property claims, meaning that a lot of the more wealthy families who had already kind of reestablished themselves or were somehow politically connected had gotten word of the war claims, but there was no media, mass media as we see it today. There was no Facebook or internet or quick ways for people to get information about the availability of war claims or how to file them. So most people actually didn't file them. The second obstacle was that while it was clear that you could file for property damage, if you were to file for personal injury or death, it would have to be approved by Congress, and the process would be really arduous, and most people were intimidated by the process. Other people came out of the war feeling like no amount of money will make up for the death of my loved one, right? So Dr. Robert Underwood regularly shares the story of his mother, who says that she would never have accepted war reparations, even when they were offered to her, because she lost a child, and she says that money is not going to bring my child back, right? So there were a lot of mixed feelings about the war claims when they were first offered. But Congress considered it a case closed. They said that this had been settled. War claims for Guam was not an issue, right? Well, then in 1951, in the Treaty of San Francisco, the U.S. and Japan came into an agreement that because Japan could not possibly afford to pay for all the war reparations or all the claims against Japan for the atrocities of the war, that the U.S. would take the assets it had frozen from Japan. So when two countries go to war, they'll freeze their assets in the event that at the end of the war, there would be things that would need to be paid for, like war claims. So because the U.S. froze the assets from Japan, they said, we will use these frozen assets to pay for any claims from U.S. citizens and nationals that had suffered on behalf of the Japanese government. So U.S. prisoners of war could file claim with U.S. Congress, and they did, and they were compensated, right? Any U.S. nationals, like at that time, the people of Guam, because the United States had already occupied Guam before the war, we were considered U.S. nationals. So therefore, we qualified to file for war reparations, and it would be the United States government that would pay the war reparations, not the government of Japan, because of this treaty, right? However, since they saw this as a closed book, people were paid immediately after the war, they never thought to compensate the people of Guam. They never thought to offer or extend any opportunity for the people of Guam to be compensated. And eventually, as Guam begins to gain voice in U.S. Congress, this is one of the biggest issues that we take on, right? And also another part of the issue is that after the war, a lot of Chamorros left Guam joining the military, right? And so that became another way in which people didn't file war claims. They were off starting a new life elsewhere in the military. And so this was a big way that the war really did affect our people. Now, if you look at census data, there are more Chamorros living away from Guam than the Chamorros who live here because of this mass basic exodus of Chamorros joining the military, right? So then, what did we do? In the 80s, a wonderful woman, former Senator Cecilia Bamba, began to collect the stories of war survivors. And she also wanted to list all of the Chamorros who had been living and died during the war. And so this woman interviewed over 1,000 people and collected their stories, collected all of these names, and basically began a report that said that no, this is not a closed case. The people of Guam deserve war reparations. She passed in 1986, and her son, who was then a senator, and Senator Marilyn Manabusan, compiled the Bamba report. And their report basically argued that the people of Guam deserve war reparations, right? And so then this was part of, and it happened around the same time as former Congressman Antonio Juan Pat was in Congress, right? And so in 1983, he introduced the first piece of legislation in Congress calling on a reopening of this and looking into whether or not war claims should be paid for Guam. And so that's what he did. In 1983, he introduced legislation to create a commission that would review the facts surrounding this issue and basically justify the need for reparations. Well, that failed, right? And then his successor, former Congressman Ben Blas, then proceeded to introduce several types of legislation, right? So in 1985, he again directs the Comptroller General of the United States to review the findings of the Guam Reparations Commission that was created locally that called on the needs for reparations. And that didn't really go anywhere. Then in 1986, he introduces H.R. 5187, which sought to establish a commission on war claims for Guam. And then after that, it failed, and then he introduces it again in 1987. And then in 1989, he comes the closest to actually achieving war reparations that would be paid for directly by the federal government. So he basically introduces a law that would compensate. It's called the Guam Claims Fund, and it would be in the amount of $20 million. And eligible claimants would receive $20,000 for death, $5,000 for personal injury, and $3,000 for forced labor, forced march, or internment. So he was starting to make leeway on this legislation, but what happened is that Congress felt that there needed to be more say from the people of Guam, right? And so Senator Inouye basically turned to the Guam legislature, and at the time there was a Guam War Reparations Commission locally, and said, is this acceptable? Well, Ben Blas, former Congressman Ben Blas shared with former Congressman Underwood that he had thought that the legislature was going to support him. They had all told him, he had gone and he had lobbied them and they said they were going to support him, but when it came time for them to vote, they all turned against the legislation, saying that the compensation was not enough. And so they proposed amendments to HR 2024 that would raise the amounts to $15,000 for personal injury, $10,000 for forced labor, and $7,000 for forced march or internment. And so basically at that point, Senator Inouye says, this is a sign that the people of Guam don't support this. We are not going to commit to those amounts. Case closed, right? And it didn't go through. And so that was something that then became an issue that Congressman Underwood took up when he came into office. Congressman Underwood initially started off reintroducing the same bill, calling on the amounts that had originally been proposed, but he also sought to set up a trust fund using the remaining balance of awards that were paid to living survivors that would sponsor research and educational activities relating to Guam's wartime experience, disperse funds into an eligible post-secondary scholarship fund, and a first-time home ownership fund. So basically what he was saying is Congress was unwilling, and still is unwilling, to pay for claims that would be made by the descendants of survivors who had died since the war. So basically, if you had a parent or a grandparent that lived through the war, survived, and has since died, like Tan Magdalena, Congress did not want to pay reparations in that way because it would set a precedent that could lead to the eventual claims from, for example, the descendants of former slaves, right, for reparations for slavery. And opening that up was not something Congress was willing to do. So Dr. Underwood's alternative was like, well, that money, instead of directly paying it to people, let's put it towards a trust fund that will pay for scholarships and new homes for people that don't have homes, right? And if you establish this trust fund, it'll also allow us to go to the Japanese government and say, would you put money into this trust fund? It's not them paying directly for war reparations, but it's still them indirectly paying for the crime or acknowledging the crime that happened, right? So that doesn't go anywhere. And basically he keeps trying, and eventually his friends in Congress say, well, you really have to prove your case. You really got them to say, you really got to get them to understand what happened and to accept that the reparations need to be paid in the first place. So we return again to the need to establish a War Claims Review Commission, right? And so the last piece of legislation that Underwood introduces in 2001 passes in 2002, and it establishes what's known as the Guam Claims Review Commission. And what this is that, for example, Japanese who were interned in the United States, before they were able to be compensated, they proved their case. The Aleutian Islanders that had also experienced the tragedies of war from being relocated because of the war were eligible for war reparations, but they proved their case through a War Review Commission. And so today, actually, we are very honored to be in the presence of one of the commissioners. Our new speaker, BJ Cruz, we had two local representatives, Speaker BJ Cruz and former Speaker Antonio Pinku. And then we had two representatives from the federal government. And so basically, the War Claims Review Commission, they got together, they were formally established, and they invited war survivors to testify. 104 survivors testified, and the commission from these testimonies concluded overwhelmingly that yes, in fact, the people of Guam had suffered during the war, and that these sufferings were not acknowledged by the United States or compensated justly, and that the initial war claims that were filed in 1945 were not effective in terms of getting people to file claims, and so that therefore the reparations needed to be paid, and they recommended the following amounts. So their conclusion was that $25,000 would be given for death, which would be paid to the descendants of those who were killed in the war, $15,000 for victims who were raped or suffered personal injury, $12,000 or $10,000 depending on the injury for those who were subjected to forced labor or suffered personal injury, and $7,000 for the descendants of deceased survivors. It also still sought to establish a grant program for research, education, and media activities. So basically, they make these recommendations in these amounts, and And the next Congress representative that comes in, Congresswoman Bordallo, introduces this legislation in these amounts and also still takes from the idea of establishing a trust fund. And so as you can see, in her 14 years, she continuously introduces the same piece of legislation and continuously gets rejected. So initially, again, the issue is with the descendants, right? And so it goes back and forth, and they say to her, okay, we're willing to fund everything else, but not the descendants of those who survived and have since died. And she says she's unwilling to accept that is not fair to the survivors or to the descendants. And so then it fails. Then she tries again with H.R. 44, which is essentially what became the legislation that we're here to talk about today. And so H.R. 44 comes back, and this time another big issue that Congress had is, well, where is the funding going to come from? Ideally, you would think that it would come from the Foreign Claims Review Commission or the Foreign Claims Fund that's already established, but Congress is still unwilling to sort of acknowledge that or pay for this obligation. So what they say instead is, okay, let's work with you. We give Guam money every year called Section 30 funds, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what those are. Well, if we just set aside a little bit of the money we give you every year anyways, we can pay the claims that way. So it's kind of acknowledging that claims need to be paid, but saying, government of Guam, you're going to have to pay for it. We're not willing to agree to this unless there's an identified funding source. So knowing that it failed previously because she had been unwilling to accept the negotiation that descendants wouldn't be paid, she eventually came to a place where now in 2015, and it passed in 2016, she said, okay, I will accept war reparations paid by Section 30 funds and descendants will not be included. And so today, where we stand is that all of these compromises that her predecessors were unwilling to accept, she was forced to accept just to really get this legislation through. And so what are we left with, right? I'm going to pause. Are there any questions before we go into what it became? No? Okay, awesome. Okay, so actually before we talk about what happened or what the legislation we have today, I also want to acknowledge the many efforts in the community that have also pushed through this legislation. So as I mentioned, former Senator Cecilia Bamba compiled these stories and names. Congressman Underwood got funding to create the wall at the Aston Overlook that includes all of the names of the survivors and also those who died during the war. This is the report that was produced by the Guam War Claims Review Commission that Speaker Cruz was part of, and I think this is really important because for a lot of these survivors, it was the first time they actually on the record shared their story. It was a very powerful moment for our community, and all of these stories are documented. This can be found online and here at the Mark. From there, the Guam War Survivors Memorial Foundation was formed, basically taking the testimonies from the Review Commission and republishing them in the Marianas Variety, having displays featuring the stories of the survivors then and now, and eventually doing a trilogy of books. So they've already published 2 books telling different war survivor stories, and also they had formed a war survivors group that was going to sue the federal government if this legislation didn't pass, or it hadn't happened quick enough, the legislation passed. And they've also worked with the children of war survivors to have new ways of commemorating and honoring the war survivors. And so this summer, they hosted a concert in which all of these really famous local musicians whose parents were survivors of the war sang songs from that era, because for a lot of war survivors, what got them through the era was music. And so that's a little bit of what else has gone into pushing for war reparations in the community. So what is the Guam World War II Claims Fund? So some of you, when you came a little early, and hopefully others that came in, I actually passed out the full language of the law, because I think it's really important as a community that we understand what it really means, right? What we really are getting. And so first of all, what Congresswoman Bordallo's legislation does is it establishes the fund. And this fund is to be funded by, so that the money used to pay reparations will come from Section 30 funds, and Section 30 funds are funds that are collected from U.S. military personnel and other federal employees living on Guam, and also U.S. military personnel who list Guam as their place of residence. Part of their taxes come back to Guam and get put into our general fund to pay for our basic public services. It's one of our 3 revenue sources. And so what the law says is that any amount of duties, taxes, and fees collected under Section 30 after fiscal year 2014 over the amount of duties, taxes, and fees collected under such section during 2014 shall be deposited into the claims fund. So what they're saying is that in 2014 it was a record high year in which Guam collected Section 30 funds. So any money more than what we collected in 2014 will be set aside, and that money will be used to pay out the claims. So it doesn't mean that there is immediately funding available for war reparations. It means that Guam will have to welcome enough military personnel in the next year to make more money than we did in from Section 30 funds in 2014 to begin paying claims, because we likely will not make enough extra money this year to pay all of the claims. And they account for that. In the law, they even say the order of priority in terms of who will be paid first. Well, the initial problem with that is that, as I mentioned earlier, most of the survivors have died. The war happened 75 years ago, right? Most of the people that are still alive, who were alive during the war, were young children, and many of them are dying daily. So even though it's been passed, the current funding source doesn't look like it's going to be paid out in the near future. And also, in order to pay it out, Guam would have to welcome more military, welcome more war to the island in order to pay for the last major war that we went through, right? So that's what the funding source is. And so Dr. Babaco is going to talk a little bit more about this.
So, este es Masito Rosanjo, Francisco Pablo Pemi. Pero Goftakilo is in asunto na marito kapta. Very important issue here. Lo naturally lo pinay na esta sen apmam na itatawta kananan gasting. Very unfortunate, but it's important that we educate ourselves about this now. And so I wanted to share a little bit about Section 30. And so as Victoria already introduced, it is money that comes from uniformed and non-uniformed personnel that are stationed on Guam or list Guam as their legal residence. And so their tax money then gets sort of, now it doesn't immediately go into the general fund. So first it's given to sort of a trusted sort of depository, which then looks at the general obligations, the debt payments and leaseback sort of obligations that Guam has, and whatever. And after that, it then goes into the general fund. And Section 30 money is used for all sorts of things once it goes into the general fund. And, oh, you know, okay. And so, as you can see, these are the adopted projections for previous years. And so, it is kind of an interesting sort of game because it identifies a funding source, but as Victoria said, it all depends then on how many military are here, how many federal employees are on the island. And so in order to get, it seems kind of like a horrible trap in a way, in order to get it quicker for those who have been waiting for so long, we have to support military increases, military spending on the island, military expansion. And so in a way, it's kind of not the message that we would want to send to the eldest generation that endured that, and then those who are young today and sort of looking to the future. It's not the way that you would want to recognize them by saying, if you just welcome more war into your island, then you can finally get the recognition you've been waiting for.
And then, you know, just another thought. So what Section 30 pays for when we say like public services is education, public health. When we've had excess funds before, the governors wanted to use it to pay tax refunds. So there are many ways in which our island needs and uses Section 30 funds. It's really Guam's way of, or the sort of shouldering the burden of the military presence here. And it's really not much when you think about how much Guam actually supports the presence of the U.S. military, which is a third of our island and pulls heavily on our infrastructure. That funding is actually really necessary to the island. And so using that funding to pay reparations will affect Guam. And not only is that funding going to pay for reparations, there's a language in the law that says that deductions from the fund will also be given back to the federal government. So an amount equal to 5% of such amounts as reimbursement to the federal government for expenses incurred by the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission and by the Department of the Treasury in the administration of this title. So 5% of that money goes back to the federal government. So we are not only paying our war reparations, we're paying the federal government for paying our war reparations, right? And so what is the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission? Basically, the next step. According to the law, the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, which is obviously a federal entity, has 180 days to set the rules and regulations for who qualifies for a claim, how they file the claim, how long it'll take to pay the claim, all of those issues. They have 180 days, right? After they come up with the rules and regulations, they're going to give the people, the remaining survivors of Guam that are eligible and the remaining descendants of those who died during the war that are eligible 1 year to file claims. They will have to physically go in and file claims. They said they will announce this in all the major media outlets. But imagine if you are in your 70s, 80s, 90s, and older, going in and again testifying and filing claims is going to also be part of the process, and you have exactly 1 year to do it. So currently, however, there are organizations that are wanting to help do this. So one of the members of the War Claims Review Commission, who has also worked with the Foreign Review Claims Commission, is extending his services. He's an attorney, and his name is Chamorro, and he's offering, because he's aware of this process, he's offering to already begin registering war survivors to be able to file claims. So getting all of their information and everything ready so that he can provide it in 180 days when the rules and regulations are made. The Guam War Survivor Memorial Foundation, the president, former Senator Frank Blas Jr., is also extending himself to the community, saying that the foundation will collect information to help people prepare for claims. But again, the claims are not happening in the near future. We've got 6 months for them to come up with rules and regulations. And then again, after that, we have to wait for enough money to be put into the fund in order for reparations to begin to be paid out. So what will be paid? In the handout I gave you, it has the details on who is eligible, but in a nutshell, if you survived the war and experienced any of the following, you would be compensated. So in the case of a victim who suffered an injury described, and so any injury during the war, $15,000. So there's two different classifications of injury, and that's $15,000 and $12,000. How these classifications will be determined will be part of the Foreign Claims Review Commission's rules and regulations. There's brief language on it in the law, but not very detailed. In the case of a victim who is not described above and they have an injury, it's $10,000. Survivors of Guam descendants, in the case of a compensable Guam descendant, $25,000 shall be given to survivors of the descendant in accordance with subsection B. What this applies to is that if you died in the war, your family is eligible to claim $25,000, but not any member of your family. Initially, it would be your spouse. If your spouse has since died, it would be your parents. If your parents have since died, it would be your children. If your children have since died, nobody can make a claim. And so that's another important aspect. If you are old enough to have been married and have children during the war, likely your spouse and many of your children may have since also passed. And more than likely your parents have since passed. And many of those who died in the war were young adults, and so their descendants would have been their parents. So many of those who did die, their families will not be compensated. And again, I must stress, because I've received phone calls from my auntie who's telling me and my mom that we should file a claim for my grandmother. And no matter how many times I tell her descendants cannot file claims, she believes because in the law there's just a mention of descendants, that descendants can file claims. The law does not allow for descendants of those who survived and have since died to file claims. Only those that I described right now. Okay, so those are the eligibility requirements. So, of course, the Congresswoman and her staff have anticipated that the community would be upset about the use of Section 30 funds. I honestly expected the community to be a little bit more upset, but I think part of the problem is that it's very convoluted, the language is unclear, and for most Manampu, the idea that Congress recognized this in any way is enough to celebrate. That says to them, finally there's recognition for what we've been through. Right? And this is why we believe that if Section 30 funds are used in this way, it's an insult to them. It's an insult to what they experience because essentially their government is paying for something that they did not create, right? An experience that they did not create and should not have to take responsibility for. So Congresswoman Bordallo and her staff have come out saying, well, we don't really intend to use Section 30 funds. Basically, what we want to do is work with the president. We hoped to work with Obama. We didn't get anywhere with him. So we're hoping to work with Calvo because he publicly endorsed Donald Trump. I have a really hard time saying President Donald Trump, but President Donald Trump. And she's saying that that's the only way, is that if Calvo and she work together and they encourage President Trump in his new budget to set aside an appropriation that is not Section 30 funds and fund the War Claims Fund, then they can actually begin. You wouldn't have to wait for Section 30 funds. If he already set aside an appropriation that was sufficient enough, they can begin processing claims in 180 days, right? But is that really a reality, right? Do we really think that this is going to happen after all of these decades of trying and trying, over 30 years of trying in Congress, and they refuse to find an appropriation for this? That's kind of what we're left with. And so we asked you, we wanted to come up with a way today to get everybody that came and learned involved. So we wrote a letter to Congresswoman Bordallo, and basically what we're asking her, and we're asking you to sign today, is to please not use Section 30 funds to pay this, and to do everything that she can to keep her word and work with Calvo and Trump to find a separate appropriation. We know this is going to be hard, and that's why we actually want her to also get to the root of the problem, which is that as an unincorporated territory, Guam really had no other option but to keep giving it away and giving it away, right? Negotiating and negotiating until you get something, right? And I recently interviewed Dr. Underwood, and I thought what he said about the matter was pretty poignant. He said, you don't get what you deserve in Congress, you get what you negotiate. So long as Guam is a possession of the United States, our ability to negotiate is very, very slim. We don't really have a lot of negotiating power. But if we were an independent nation and we came into this situation differently, where we did have more power and more voice, would we have a different result, right? Would we be paying our own reparations? Likely not. Most independent nations probably would not stand for the country that's responsible to pay war reparations saying, well, we'll pay it, but technically you're going to pay it. Is that okay? Right? No, we wouldn't want to stand for that because it's not about the money. It's about the recognition and the acknowledgement of something that has been pushed away and ignored for so long, right? And so we have the letter that went around. Sorry, it blanked out. Okay, there we go. And so we're asking you today to please sign on. So what we're saying to her is that we know this will be difficult, and so we want you to get to the root of this, and we want you to work in Congress to identify more funding for political status education for Guam, and also to continue to lay the groundwork in Congress for Guam's decolonization. Because just as hard as Guam fought for war reparations, we will have to fight incredibly hard for whatever political status option we choose as a people. This is why we cannot continue to delay that, because that's another long saga with another long timeline, right? We cannot continue to delay this, and what our community needs is genuine education on what these three statuses offer us and the ability to be an informed populace choosing a better future for our island. The federal government signed on to the United Nations Charter and agreed to fund education efforts that would lead to the eventual decolonization of their territories. And so we need more funding for that. The most recent appropriation we got was $300,000, right? But also laying again the groundwork that whatever Guam chooses, Congress will respect. that we won't have to negotiate and negotiate and negotiate until we end up the same kind of colony and the same kind of situation that we're in. And so that's why we're making that appeal today. And ultimately, we want to leave you with this image, which is immediately after the war, and it's one of my favorite images, and it's just this notion of what are we and what have we passed on to future generations, right, from that time to today, and what will we continue to pass on, what will we continue to ask for our people. And so we have been asking for independence, and we hope that you'll continue to stay informed and to keep up with our efforts. Every month we have a General Assembly in which we take a different educational focus. And so we have handouts from all of our meetings and each one of those educational presentations, each on a different topic. And our next meeting will be Thursday, January 26th at 6 p.m. at the Chamorro Village. We meet every fourth Thursday at 6 p.m. at the Chamorro Village. So I really hope that we see you there. And now we can open up for questions. Yes, Javier.
So just to recap, the Section 30 funds is from uniformed and non-uniformed personnel, basically military personnel who claim Guam as their residence, right?
That's one of the classifications. So it's also military personnel, federal contract employees that are serving or that are working on Guam. Part of their tax dollars come back to Guam for hosting them. And then I believe it was Congressman Underwood who introduced legislation to include residents of Guam who are in the military serving elsewhere. A percentage of their money comes back.
So the active duty personnel, they don't have to claim Guam as their residence, right?
No. It's only if you're a resident of Guam serving elsewhere, you still give back to the community. And as I mentioned, this is one of our 3 main sources of revenue. So we definitely do use Section 30 funds for really practical things. So, and our appropriations chair knows. Yes.
Just one more question. Maybe I couldn't find it in the law, but it's post-traumatic stress. I know it was briefly talked about. Part of the injury, that was part of that small discussion of the injury portion of the compensation.
It's not expressly stated in the law, though I'm sure that that would be something included in the rules and regulations from the Foreign Review Claims Commission. And when you did the War Claims Review Commission, was that something that was also included?
We figured that it would be too hard to distinguish between the different injuries, and so we only had one category.
Okay, and I think that that's why they're kind of given this. I mean, I think it's a rather long time frame of 6 months, considering that these have been paid out in many different places in many different ways. But we would hope that they have these different classifications. And I believe and it's in the law that the priorities will be to compensate the immediate survivors that are still alive, that are older. They have prioritized that. But again, it would all depend on how much money goes in the fund, how many people will get compensated. And it's also not very clear like who actually sets the money aside. Does the federal government take the money before the Section 30 funds are given to the general fund here, or do we set it aside ourselves, and then therefore will the checks be cut by the government of Guam? It's all confusing. Do you know? That's the part I was unclear about.
They would have to take it in Washington.
Okay,
They
and
would
put
set
it in the
aside,
fund.
yeah, before they sent it to Guam, because once it gets to Guam, it's ours.
Okay. So essentially you could see that as taking money away from the government of Guam, which is then why we're saying the government of Guam is basically paying their own war reparations. Yes?
First question, so this legislation can't be affected by the new administration?
It was signed into law by President Obama on December 23rd. So it's an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which must pass every year. And so that was sort of the clever move of attaching it to that. But if you actually look at all the amendments related to Guam in the NDAA, there was an obvious negotiation because there's a lot of amendments that fund the increased military presence, that welcome warships from Taiwan, for example, which really could put Guam in a bad place in the conflict between the U.S. and China and Taiwan, especially when we think about Donald Trump having already upset China on the issue of Taiwan. So Guam will also be hosting drones that will be spying on North Korea and China and are very new. The technology is very new, hasn't really been tested. up to $80 million will go towards renovating homes in Anderson. Can you imagine if we had $80 million to finally provide infrastructure for the Chamorro Land Trust lands that we can't occupy because there's no infrastructure for? All of that was also approved in the NDAA for Guam. So there was a lot of money given to Guam on the base. And the only thing sort of there that, you know, and in this case, there's no real commitment, but there was a great immediate commitment to expanding the U.S.'s military presence. That's why I'm saying that in order to pay for one war, we make Guam a bigger target in the future, which is also an irony in the situation and very sad.
So could you talk about the scenario where Congressman Redalia and Governor Calvo were able to lobby President-elect Trump to appropriate funds on the side? Should that not happen, then the legislation for funding for this would come from Section 30?
Exactly. Right now, that they'll proceed as the law dictates. So the Foreign Claims Review Commission, I'm sure, will immediately begin doing their rules and regulations because they have 180 days. If in 180 days and there's no other solution, then and once the money is available, it will be put in that fund because that's what the law dictates. So it is a short window where Calvo and Redalia would have to push to find an alternate funding source. Yes.
Who is a member of the Guam War Claims Commission? Do you know?
There isn't an existing one. The former Guam War Claims Review Commission, one member is here, Speaker Cruz, but we don't have a Guam War Claims Commission today.
Is there an active War Claims Commission? There isn't.
No, there was one.
So my follow-up question is, Congress is mandating our local government to pay this with excess Section 30 money. And do I understand, I mean, I know you put numbers up on the board, and it had 2016 as having $77 million in Section 30 money, right? But I believe that figure was a little bit higher. I think it went up to about 120 million and all. So, and it's saying that it's going to be appropriated from
2014 on.
Right.
However, the government has spent any excess funding from 2015.
So if they're saying anything over 77,000, what shown on the board should have been, if we didn't spend it already, they need to take it and put it into a fund to pay this.
The way that it's worded is that you take 2014 as the year.
The back number, right?
And for that year, the question becomes, is it what we set aside in the budget law for 2014, or was it how much we received in 2014? Because you're correct up there that it was 67, I think, but in actual fact, we collected almost 87 for 2014. So in order to get to excess, you would have to collect more than 87, or is it 67? That's not clear in the legislation, which amount. It just says the amount received in Section 30 for 2014. But it's not clear whether or not it's the...
Yeah, the legislation says collected. And so what we showed, and because there is nowhere that clearly says the exact amount that was collected, but Carmelito, the spokesperson for Regalio, said that it was close to $87,000. I mean, million, sorry.
Yeah, you'd be able to find it on the GID website.
Okay.
And our website, or people of how much was actually received that year.
Okay.
So rather than the 67 as the benchmark, it's going to be 87. So until we receive more than 87, there'll be no money that will be excess. And this last year, we only got, I think it was 77 at the most. There hasn't been a year where there was 120, or at least not anything that was recorded as 120.
Wow, so what the Vice Speaker is saying then is that, because again, 2014 was a record year, and so the way that Bergalio has written this, it's in anticipation of the Guam military buildup. which there have been many delays, and many driven also by the community questioning the need for this split up or what's going to happen to our island as a result of this split up. And so these projections are based on this notion that between now and 2023 is when they're actually going to start to begin bringing in troops according to their record of decision. We likely won't see such an increase up to 87 million until 2023, if that happens, right?
And we've got to catch, it really is a catch-22, because you'll never get to that amount. And now that President Trump is pushing for a tax reduction, when he does that, then the Section 30 will go down, because the amount of taxes being paid by the military and the federal employees that are here will be less than, and so we may never get to the 87.
Exactly.
So my last question is, who would be responsible to appoint a new commission?
There's nobody responsible for appointing a new commission. There hasn't been a determination that there is a need for a new commission.
So the commissions were created at the time to prove to Congress basically that there was a need to pay reparations. Because Congress was sort of saying, no, this was already settled in 1945, right? So it became, we need to prove that our people suffered and that they weren't compensated. I think maybe what you might be asking is the Foreign Claims Review Commission is who pays it out.
So I guess we will review the war claims.
The Foreign Claims Review Commission, which is the federal entity that's been appointed by law to do it. Guam does not have a representative. All they've committed to is working with the Guam War Survivor Memorial Foundation to identify survivors, but no, they don't have a representative from Guam. Yeah, which is also a big, I would think that would be something that should have been included. So yes, this is a really, so it's one of those things where there is obvious celebration in our community, but when you actually look at what's happening, the greatest difficulty now is for those that survived the war and really believe that they're going to receive compensation soon. There's not enough explanation happening in the community to tell them that the money is not coming anytime soon. And so, also if you know survivors, please share with them the copy of the legislation, talk with them about it. Are there any survivors of the war here today? Anybody in the room a war survivor? So we want to, acknowledge as well what you've been through, and that's a lot of we're doing this today for you to really explain, what's happened, and we don't believe that this is just for you.
I was too young. I was about 2 years old at the time when the Japanese invaded Guam. So most of my parents are responsible for me walking, being carried on the shoulder of my father and my mother. I see Japanese soldiers when the Americans came in and started bombing Guam. I've seen quite a few dead Japanese soldiers with bloated stomach.
You can tell the survivors by the Japanese immunization shots. There's 4 dots on all my aunts' uncles. That's how I remember.
Would anyone else like to say anything or any more questions?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for the presentation tonight. My mother has several siblings and first cousins who survived the war, and actually my uncle called me last week saying, your mom's going to get, they need to come and listen to this, because it's not happening anytime soon.
Yeah.
And that's really, really unfortunate, because the way it's presented out there, it's like, get ready to line up and fill out the form and check's going to be in the mail, but the truth has to be told, because it's not.
And I think that, now that I'm listening, I think another thing we can ask of the Congresswoman, and we can add it in another letter, is to do that, to have public hearings in the villages now explaining the legislation, giving a timeline, and they should be responsible for ensuring that information is collected now so that the process is faster. But we could do that. We could add that to the letter that you've all signed today. We'll add an amendment or like an extra memo that calls on them to explain this to the community and answer the community's questions, because really they've not been available for that. So, you know, when we look at the way our local laws are made, there's public involvement, there's a public hearing process, we can write letters, we can talk directly with our officials, but Congresswoman Redaglio does a lot of things in the name of Guam that we have no say in. And like I mentioned, if you look at the NDAA, you go online where I pulled that from and you just do a search for Guam, like over 80 mentions of Guam, and majority of that is to support the effort to add more and more military presence to the island. And all of that is done and introduced by Redaglio herself with no input from the community and no obligation to inform the community of what's being done until it's done, right? So, part of the problem, and we really need to hold our representative accountable, because if these are things that we don't necessarily want for our island, there's got to be an easier way to express that, right? So we're starting with the letter writing today, but you can make calls to her Guam office and express yourself. I highly encourage that. I think it was Trevor Noah last night. I watched the Daily Show. He makes fun a lot of Donald Trump and the whole process, but they were talking about how still in Congress the biggest difference is made with the telephone, because you can clog their telephones and keep calling and calling. It's not Facebook, it's not Twitter unless you're Donald Trump himself. But if you call your representative and you keep that line ringing, they have to pay attention to you. And in Guam, that's even more of a possibility. Our elected officials are so accessible to us. We need to tell them when we think they're doing a good job, and we also need to tell them when we think that they're not, or when we need them to advocate for us in different ways. So call Congresswoman Redaglio's office, right? That's what the Guam office is here for. Yes.
I just really want to commend you.
Thank you.
No, really, seriously. When I walked in and you started the presentation, that was the clearest explanation of what happened over the last 70 years. It's better than what we have here.
I can't take credit. I've spent a lot of years because of our war survivors telling this story. So it's part of really why I do this work. Is I was really young when I interviewed our war survivors. Like I said, I was 18 years old, and I had to do a today in history of the last 8 days of the war, and it changed my whole life. And so that's why I've cared so much and kept up with it so much. So.
And in your history with all the different Congress people about what happened, and a recognition, because I'm embarrassed to say that we did not recognize Congressman Bloss correctly for his near successful effort. I mean, he had Inouye there for us, like Inouye got it for the Japanese and the Aleutian, and Ted Stevens for the Aleutians, and we looked the gift horse in the mouth and punched it, and we lost it. And then the only other thing that you did not mention was that in our findings, we did provide for descendants.
Oh, in 1991.
1990.
This is right.
In law, there is no tort that survives a person's death. You can only give an award to somebody that actually died during the 3.5 years that the war was on. But everybody that lived past July 21st, 1944, unless they were alive at the time that the bill passed, would not be considered as eligible. What Speaker Ompinko did, in spite of the fact that all four other attorneys on the commission said that it was a legal fiction and impossibility to take it all the way back to 1944. I mean, he stood his ground and insisted that we had to recognize their descendants, and you know, that same 1990, and so the commission in recognition and in the hopes of getting the speaker to be the fifth vote, so we would have a unanimous report, agreed that, all right, we will say everybody who was alive in 1990, who would have and could have received an award but for what happened at the Guam legislature, should be able to apply and be a compensable descendant. And but that was the only concession we could give. Unfortunately, in the law that finally passed, that provision was lost.
Exactly.
And so it's just everybody that was alive on December the 23rd, 2016, and that will be able to get listed.
Exactly. Yeah, and so what he's saying is that because it was supposed to be paid that year, and if you've died since that year, then your descendants can be eligible because you would have been paid that year. They did include that provision. And that was really clever, but it didn't last into the final legislation. So again, you get what you negotiate. We need to negotiate stronger. We need stronger voices representing us, and we need to push them to make them louder. So, any other questions? Well, I thank you all so much for coming tonight. We can make this information more available on our website. We will send the letter to Congresswoman Berdalio tomorrow. Actually, we really appreciate your signature. And please join us at our next Independence General Meeting. And we also have the opportunity, if you'd like for us to come and talk with your family and friends about independence or even on this topic, we are very open to doing that. And so our email address is independentguahan@gmail.com. It's on all of our promotional materials that we've given out. Or you can even just, I'll give my number actually, and you can contact me or our chairperson. Can I give your number too?
Sure.
Okay, so our person that normally people can contact to organize meetings is actually off item for 10 days, so we'll list the two of us. So my number is 487-5652, and the get is 988-7106. And so if you'd like us to come and talk with your family, if you have war survivors that have questions, we would love to be able to answer them. Yes?
Just what Kathy was asking, I mean, that presentation was so well presented. Is there a possibility that on your website that can be uploaded so that whoever wants to listen to it can go to it? I mean,
Yes.
we all obviously couldn't come, and the media's not going to be able to run that without our presentation. But if it's someplace that they can go to, and we can refer people to it, then they can, at their own leisure, hear it and understand this whole process.
Definitely. I know we are recording.
Yeah, I know, I saw that over there.
Yeah, so we will work actually to expedite it. It takes a little time to process and put online, but we will do that. And then as soon as we actually upload it on our website, we can put out a press release and an email to everybody. If you signed in our sign-in sheet, we'll email you as soon as it's available and online.
Thank you.
Thank you.